in my research, what I found is that there's some significant shifts that we need to make as leaders and as communities and as organizations in response to the emerging trends that we've got. And one of the big first shifts is around worldviews, coming back to what we started the conversation with. And the shift is looking at, it's an expansion shift as opposed to from this to that, it's this and that. And in business, one of the main principles is around growth. It's kind of the meta story of what business is all about. More. And we're nudging up against the ceiling of what that means. We're burning people out. We're using up resources on the planet and causing ripple effects we hadn't intended. So the shift in terms of our worldview that needs to happen to guide our businesses moving forward is growth and knowing how much is enough.
Welcome to the People Powered Solutions podcast. In this show, you'll gain expert advice and tips on building a thriving workplace culture with happy employees. I'm your host, Lorianne Duguay, and I'm thrilled to be spending this time with you today. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the People Powered Solutions podcast. Today, we welcome Zoë Routh, a leadership expert and also a fellow Canadian. So Zoë, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Lorianne. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. So Zoë, tell us a little bit about your story, how you ended up doing what you do and what it is specifically you do.
All right. So I love this starting point. It probably, for me, when it comes to leadership and working with teams, started in Northwest Ontario in the middle of summer with my head underneath a canoe and my face buried in the mud.
Wow.
Which doesn't sound like a very great starting point for leadership. And yet I was on a canoe trip with a group of 7 young women and 2 trippers, as we call them, canoe trip leaders. And we were doing a portage. And I was carrying canoe and I'd slipped and it was muddy and it was raining and it was horrible. And I couldn't get out from underneath this canoe. And I was whinging and horrible and blaming. And then I had a little epiphany, as you do when things are not going so well. It's like, all right, what do I do about this? And I decided to ditch my negative attitude and problem solve my way out of it. And that was my first sort of foray into, first of all, independence. And then that led me into thinking about, well, the team actually needs this canoe. It's not just me out here. I'm part of a whole ecosystem of trying to portage this equipment across this bridge of land to their next destination. So there's a little bit of reliance on me to get this thing done. So that was a sense of personal responsibility to the team and kind of an emerging sense of what it means to operate with a bunch of other people trying to accomplish a task and have an experience together. So that led me summer after summer to work at summer camp, first as a summer camp counselor, then leading canoe trips, and then as head of the out tripping program and hiring and training all the canoe trip leaders. And that love of working with people and the wilderness had me get curious about what other ways I could do this full-time year-round. And I discovered that there was this place called Outward Bound. They had schools all around the world, and they had schools in Australia. And one of my friends from camp had been to Australia, and kind of the whole romance and ethos and idea of Australia sounded exciting. Beaches, sunshine, warmth.
Yeah, I'm thinking like if you're up in Northwestern Ontario or in Winnipeg, the sun is what's attracting me, and the long summers. I'm all about that. I'd be in.
That's right. So I got a job with Outward Bound, which is personal and leadership development in the outdoors. And I came out to Australia. I'm in Australia now in 1996 for a 13-month contract, which seemed like forever. And that turned into 9 years working for that organization. They sponsored my residency. And I dove even more deeply into team leadership, team development, culture of an organization. And that kind of, those two themes, wilderness teams, wilderness and people, have threaded through the work that I do now. So after I left Outward Bound, I set up my own executive coaching and leadership development business, which I did part-time while I worked at another organization called the Australian Rural Leadership Foundation. And that extended my leadership knowledge and understanding even further by looking at leadership in very different contexts, leading communities, leading industry sectors, that kind of stuff. And then I went full-time in my business in 2014. So that's been almost 9-10 years now. And I've written a few books along the way. And the work that I do now with leaders is about how do you lead strategy? How do you lead culture? And how do you lead yourself so that you actually survive and thrive in that environment? So that's sort of where I'm up to today.
I love it. Lots of synergy between the work that we do here at People Powered Solutions and the work that you do. And it's always so great to speak to other people because we know that our scope of impact is only so big. So if we can multiply the amount of people who are supporting and putting these ideas out there and helping people understand how to show up better as leaders for their team members, then I say that our purpose is served if we're able to broaden that scope of impact at the end of the day, right? So you're still in Australia. So lucky you. You don't get the 8 months of winter that we contend with up in my neck of the woods. You said that this is the work you do now with leaders. You help them lead themselves, lead strategy, and then lead their organizations. If you had to come up with the most popular kind of pain points that you're usually brought in to address, what would those be?
All right. So the presenting problem, the one that they're happy to talk about, is usually the CEO talking about their teams, to their executive team, going, they are stuck in silos. They don't get their head above the parapet. They're not strategic enough. That's sort of pain point number one. Pain point number two would be they're squabbling. They're like, they don't get along. I don't get along. There's some sort of conflict within the group. So in which case, that's a culture piece. The first piece would be about developing the strategic abilities. And the second piece would be like, let's fix the team culture and the organizational culture. The third challenge, which is not the one they lead with, which is always in the back of the CEO's mind, is how can I do this thing better? Like, I have the imposter syndrome. I would like to have more confidence as a leader. So that's sort of swimming in the background as well. And often associated with that is, how do I improve the relationship with my chair if they're in a not-for-profit or public organization? And so that relationship. So the CEO is really meat in the sandwich between their executive and the board. And it's quite a pivotal, linchpin, squished kind of role. And they need a lot of support generally to be successful.
I 100% agree. And I'm going to come back to a few of the things you mentioned. But the one thing I've heard loud and clear from my leaders is that it's a very lonely place to be. And I know it sounds like, so hard being the head of the organization. Like, there are worse problems, but it absolutely is a lonely place because you are the conduit between your direct reports and whichever leadership team you're dependent on, be it a board of directors, a governing body, or your actual senior leadership C-suite folks. You're that in between, like you said, you're that linchpin, and it's a real difficult place to be. And it's, I think, even more, and it's funny how you mention it as the third thing, because it's often where they fail to address some of those symptoms, some of the stuff that's happening there. They won't necessarily own it because they don't want to talk to their peers and show up as incompetent. Definitely won't speak to their direct reports to lose any credibility, right? And they don't want to go to their senior team because they don't want to look like they hired someone who is not doing things the way they're supposed to. So it is such a lonely place to be. And yeah, absolutely. Usually if they have enough foresight to say, I'm going to bring someone in to coach our leadership team, I think that as a starting point can be extremely game changing, because that coach is able to not only bring the level of self-awareness to that leader, but also helps them be very tactical in how they're going to address and mitigate any gaps or any, skills delays or whatever they identify that they want to grow and stretch into. They've got someone to kind of coach them along the way. It's a lot less daunting when you're finally not feeling so alone anymore, right?
Yeah, that's right. So there's a support element to it. Then there's also getting another pair of eyes on the situation and offering a different framework or a different point of view with it can be quite enlightening. So a lot of the work that I do is offering those frameworks. Like, let's look at this through a developmental lens. What are the challenges that you're facing because of the different leadership maturity of the individuals or of you, the leader, and where then can we work on finessing the capabilities at that level or stretching into the next level. So that perspective piece is really important. In fact, I think perspective is one of the most underrated capabilities in leadership. It's not often spoken about in those terms. I think it's something that would be of value for leaders to explore, first of all, their own point of view, as well as the people around them, and how those can sometimes miss like that or sometimes clash, because it's sometimes at the root of a lot of problems when we're talking two different languages, which are based in points of view. So that's what I would add to the table in terms of what an outsider a coach could offer.
Yeah, absolutely. And then eventually maybe enough self-awareness for them to embrace the value of that diversity of perspective, and for them to suddenly be more open to enlisting their peers in troubleshooting some of their challenges, right? And understanding that they're not being judged, that there's actual value in multiplying perspectives at the table to make sure that we're coming up with a real robust, fulsome solution at the end of the day, or strategy, be it whatever they're working on.
Yeah.
I agree.
That's actually really hard to do, like to embrace somebody else's point of view. And it takes leadership maturity in order to be able to do that. I think those of us who practice in this space, you go, yeah, get it. Like everybody has got a different point of view. It's all valuable. And yet when we're confronted with that, really, like it's really hard to say, well, this is my truth. I feel really comfortable in this. And then somebody else is over here with their perspective. It's hard to dial down the inner voices like, well, my view is better, my way of doing it is better. And so that takes deliberate intention and deliberate practice to dial down that my way is better voice, I think.
Yeah. And I find that voice is much louder for newer leaders who are still trying to kind of, they're not territorial, they're not posturing, but they really want to step into their leadership role and own it. But sometimes there's a bit of a blurred line in terms of what that actually entails. And so they don't want to appear unknowledgeable or not have the answers, or have their answers not respected, or their authority not respected. So they tend to have that voice a lot louder in their mind, I think, and they tend to be a bit more forceful with their ideas.
Well, it feels more comfortable. Like what is more comfortable. So you're probably going to rally around it. Like the wonderful little story. I did Myers-Briggs profile with lots of my clients, and I got my husband to do it as well, so we could compare how we are. And do you know that assessment tool at all, by the way?
I do know the Myers-Briggs. I'm a huge fan of everything DISC, but Myers-Briggs is one that I'm familiar with as well. Yeah.
I use DISC mostly, and Myers-Briggs is useful, but way more complex and hard to remember. That's why I prefer DISC. In any case, we did our profiles and
everything DISC.
Oh, you did everything DISC. Oh, like you got a whole, what is that? That's a brick of some sort.
It's a brick. It's just because I'm a licensed partner with them. So I love this. I think it's a powerful tool, and there's like 9 different tools that we use, and I use them depending on my work with leaders or my work with just employees. And also you referenced conflict. There's a whole productive conflict profile now. Anyways, that we can get to that after. I'll let you go with your story on Myers-Briggs.
Well, it would apply in the same context, whether in terms of how we show up on the DISC profile. So in that Myers-Briggs, he profiled as ISTJ, which he's a lawyer. So he's very analytical, process driven. So on DISC, conscientious, systems, rules, quality, precision. And I profile polar opposite on both of those assessment tools.
This is really interesting.
So opposite balance.
Same thing. I'm a very high ID, and my husband, spouse of 27 years, is a very, very strong C. So yin and yang, I agree, balance, polar opposites, balance, but definitely some potential for tension here and there.
That's right. So I was unpacking the profile with him and explaining the differences and stuff. And he says to me, without any, I don't think there was any irony, but there might have been, I'm not sure. It's kind of got a subtle sense of humor. Maybe it's not so subtle. He said, so when you do this work, do you teach people how to be more ISTJ? Like, do you teach people to be more like my way of doing things? You kind of missed the whole point there, honey.
yeah, but that's the thing though. Certain styles in their mind, that's the only way to be like, and that's why it's so earth-shattering for them when someone is approaching a task completely differently with completely different priorities. And I think that translates perfectly into the conversation, in that as a leader, you have to take the time to map out and recognize the different personalities that you do have on your team. And it's not to say that one's better than the other. That's not at all the case, right? They're all equal in my eyes. And a real high-performing team will have a blend of all styles, because we need that balance, right? We need those analytics. We need those, I call them my cheerleaders. We need those who nurture the person aspect, and we need those more dominance type personalities to drive progress and results. I get that. But as a leader, it's your job to take the time to look at what you're playing with, not only on your team, with your peers, with your senior leaders. Then you adapt your approach accordingly. Absolutely. 100%. You touched on something that I'm very passionate about. I love my DISC a little too much, maybe, but I think I feel like everyone who hits a certain age in their career
should take the DISC or take any version of a personality assessment tool just to increase. You can only operate as efficiently as you're aware of some of your blind spots, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
When you were talking about the 3 big pain points that clients normally come to you with, I love how you prefaced it with they present to me with this. So can you just give us a bit more insight on why you would have worded it that way?
Well, there's what they say, and then there's the subtext and what's beneath the surface. That's why I say it that way. It's like, okay, this is like you're front of mind. You're happy to talk about this issue because it's sort of, for them, it feels like it's a little bit external to them. And so it's a way of sensitively putting an issue on the table without feeling too vulnerable when they're talking with someone they may not know that well to begin with. Absolutely. And it's only in exploring a little bit of the issue that we might get to, what about your challenges? And it takes a while to build the rapport enough so that they can actually speak more openly, more open-heartedly away about how they're actually contributing to the issue. I certainly wouldn't lead that in the first 10 minutes of a conversation. No. Like, so how are you contributing to the issue? Yeah. Yeah. So
how are you getting in your way here? I think that's a little too soon, but I agree. I don't know about you, but have you found that sometimes what they think the problem is, they come to you making certain assumptions about what the root of the problem is, and they're coming to you for you to fix it. And then when you start to dig a bit deeper, that's why I like the way that you said present as, because often they'll come to me with certain assumptions that they know what's going on. And when we start to dig a bit deeper, they get a few aha moments in a row. They're like, really?
Yeah. Oh. One of my key strategies I use with leaders when we're looking at presenting problems is I have 3 principles when it comes to strategic thinking. One is to look far from a time horizon into the past and into the future, and look at the patterns that are have emerged to present to this, arrive at the present day situation, then look far into the future. What if we do nothing? What if we change something? What does that look like? So look far is the first principle. Dive deep to echo your language is the second principle, which is where we use different strategic tools to unpack, to look at the root causes of the problem. So what is underneath all of that? And it's often not just the Band-Aid pain point. There's a lot of things that are causing that. And the third way of looking at it is to reach wide. What are the ripple effects of this in terms of on us, the team, the organization, the community, and the broader industry? So those are the 3 broad principles in terms of looking at the problem. And once we start to unpack it through that lens, it's like, right. Yeah. So the surface top level Band-Aid solution is probably a little bit more complex, and probably will take a little bit more time often to tweak things within the system to cause the outcome that they prefer.
Love it. 2-word sentences are really great at guiding just that digging deeper exercise. You talked about how you've worked with clients in the past, some of their pain points. Are there some success stories that you'd like to share with our listeners in terms of what it is they came to you with, and how you worked with them, and then what the outcome was, and something that you've noticed, something that they may be able to implement themselves after listening to this episode in terms of a quick win that they would have gotten from your work together?
Sure. Here's a very simple one. Well, simple in that it's complex. So I'm working with a CEO of a construction company, and the presenting problem, that language is now sticking with me now.
I love it.
The issue that he comes with is like, right, my workers won't complete the paperwork. Seems like a simple problem. I'm like, right. And so he's like, they just don't have the discipline for it. I need to make negative consequences for them, maybe a punishment thing. I'm like, okay, hang on. Let's dig into this a little bit. So the tool that we used was called a problem tree. And if you Google that, you can see examples of problem tree. It's a nice metaphor for using visual methodology to unpack the issue. So above, are you familiar with this particular strategy?
Yeah.
Okay. So for those listening or watching who aren't, the problem is the trunk of the tree, and the branches and leaves are what are the effects of that problem. So everybody can talk about that, So guys aren't completing their paperwork, and this is the knock-on effect. Projects are delayed. We get inaccurate reports, blah, blah, blah. So the idea then is to look below the surface and follow the roots down as to what's contributing to that particular problem. So as he started to unpack it, and I just asked a couple of questions. It's like, well, what's causing that effect? Like, why would they find it difficult to complete the paperwork? So he went with, they're lazy. as the starting point. I'm like, okay, what else could be? What about the process of completing the paperwork is
kind of
problematic?
systemic barriers might be at play here.
Exactly. And it's like the paperwork is onerous, it's paper-based, it's hard to access, and so on. So as he dug into it, he realized that what he actually needed was an online platform to complete the paperwork, which would solve pretty much 90% of the issues. And so he implemented that. It was simply a way of constructing a form online. And he implemented that, and it cleaned up that whole problem. So this thing that was really causing all these knock-on effects was a very simple intervention, but he wouldn't have gotten to that. In fact, he jumped to the personality explanation.
Absolutely.
And I think that's often where leaders go. It's like, it's these personality complex. In fact, that whole idea that it's personality problems led me to write my fourth book, People Stuff, and which the subtitle is Beyond Personality Problems, an Advanced Handbook for Leadership. And the idea here is like, okay, it's not just personality clashes. There's often some systemic issues, as you mentioned, that are at play here. So if we look below the surface and unpack the systems, often we can alleviate some of those effects, or some of those problems that arise. So I try and dial away from personality clash as the root, as a part of the problem.
Yeah.
Though circling back around on that, in some cases, that differences of perspective, not necessarily personality, can be a part of the mix. In which case you come back full circle to let's do some awareness about how people are different. And sometimes it's a values clash, though, and that's a different situation altogether.
That's a whole other ballgame for sure. But I like your question of, what if it wasn't personality? What if I were to reframe this issue and I'm trying to figure out why it is they're not completing that and why they're not doing the paperwork? What might be preventing them? And being lazy or personality is not an option. That'll force that kind of additional brainstorming. And it's funny because I've got parallel stories, well, we have a procedure for this. There's an SOP, a standard operating procedure. People are just not using it. And then I'll say, well, have you guys formalized this? Yeah, it's in a procedure. Well, evidently, the procedure is either not being read or it's not being applied. So now let's come at that problem from this angle. Why is it not being applied? What is happening that's either preventing them to assimilate whatever information that's in that procedure? Is it the way it's written? Is it too long? Is it the way that it's structured? Is it too complex? Do we need to simplify the language? Do we need to showcase them on little videos because that would be more manageable? Like just to think outside the box of if it's there and it's not being used, then it's probably not structured or delivered or being assimilated in a format that they can manage. So let's rethink that. How could we recreate it? How could we do this differently? One of the big trends I see is they'll come to me saying, we need a training for this. I'm like, oh, okay. Why do we need a training for this? Well, because they're obviously not doing it. So they must need training. Well, not everything is solved with training, although obviously training is very helpful. Let's first think about what it is exactly. Similar to your problem tree, I use action mapping. I don't know if you're familiar with Kathy Moore and her action mapping, but you start with what is it they're supposed to be doing? And you start with that. And then start to identify what needs to happen for them to do that. And then from there, you go, okay, what do we need to provide them for that to happen? And then you kind of grow from there, kind of like, I guess, a mind map of sorts.
Yeah.
And it'll often not finish in training. It'll often finish with, they need a tool, they need a resource, they need something different. We need to restructure the way that procedure happens. And that'll solve the problem, right? So I love that story. And I love that you've shared a very specific, probably very relevant problem that a lot of people have, and to reframe it and think about what might, rather than, kind of chalking it all up to personality, what else might be at play here?
There's another question that comes, why aren't they doing it? Along that starting point in the action mapping, as you talked about, is why is this policy important? And I think that's probably the very first thing, because often people won't follow a policy if they disagree with it or they don't see its point. And I remember this so clearly at Outward Bound, where we had a shoe policy, literally a shoe policy. And the shoe policy was, you must wear covered shoes when driving. you must wear covered shoes when you're working down below. Down below was a place where all the equipment was.
Okay.
The idea was so that you are safe. You don't have things dropping on your feet when you're working with equipment. And when you're driving, you don't have things crawling on your feet, interfering with the pedals. And there was some very strong avoidance of that policy, people not wearing their shoes while driving. And that was a concern, like vehicles and driving, very big risk in the outdoors. Actually, one of the bigger riskier activities is driving with colleagues and participants. And that was a big problem. So we unpacked this a little bit more, or I was, because I was in charge of that stupid policy at the time. And parts of it were really important. Like the biggest factor in people not complying with that policy was location. So in far north Queensland, where it's tropical, it is hot and sweaty, and your feet get subjected to, what is it, like foot rot, basically.
Yeah.
Asking them to wear boots or shoes in a tropical environment is just asking for them to get fungus on their feet. And so they were like, I don't want to, and nobody in Queensland, it's kind of like a shoeless practice in a lot of places. People just go barefoot a lot because it's freaking hot. So there was a cultural imperative as well as an environmental imperative about not wearing shoes while driving in the vehicle. So it made us reassess the policy and actually put a little waiver in there saying in certain climates where there's a risk to foot, then you can wear thongs. Like thongs in Australia are like flip-flops. Different visual.
You've adopted the language. You've been there long enough.
That's right. I just remembered. I'm like, oh yeah, thongs are like G-strings in Canada. I got to remember that. Yeah.
Flip-flops here.
So that'd be a whole other story and another policy about what to wear while driving.
So you added a waiver within a disclaimer of sorts that if you did that very narrow category, then you could exceptionally wear flip-flops.
It's about asking what is the real ramification of this policy? Like if we just say there's a rule and we're trying to just put a blanket over this risk factor, sometimes in practical application, it doesn't make sense, or we haven't considered all the parameters that go into that. And for me, it was when I came up against this, it was an awareness as a manager that applying rules in a blanket way isn't always the best thing, and that we need nuance. There's layers and shades of gray that we need to contend with when we're doing management activities. And now some policies are black and white, that there is no flexing around it because it really is a clear safety issue associated with it.
Absolutely.
And shoes and vehicles was not one of those.
Yeah, there you go. It's extremely helpful in that we tend to approach policies and procedures in a very uniform fashion. But we know that we also have to deal with a lot of pushback in light of that approach, right? So it speaks to adapting your approach and understanding that gray and taking the time to assess, but also to revisit policies that might no longer be relevant. That's another big one. I worked with an organization that I got to talk about the most engaging onboarding experience. Before even getting any systems access, individuals had to sit down and read through 213 ISO procedures. So that's like safety. Yes, 213. And they had to click through the screens, and there were PDFs that would pop up. And once they'd opened it, they'd shut it down. Do you really think they read through all of those? Absolutely not. And then when I asked them, well, why do they have to read through all of those in one fell swoop? Like, is there not a way we could make this more manageable, chunk it out a bit, give them, here's a challenge. You have to gamify it, maybe have them read through 5 a day until they hit the mark. And I said, and do they really need to read all 213? They're like, well, I don't know. It's always been done that way. Well, just because it's always been done that way doesn't mean that it is resonating with your people, and it may in fact be contributing to your high turnover within the first 3 weeks of employment, right? Like, if I was a betting gal, I would put my money on that being one of the contributing factors, right? So to make sure that you're revisiting these things regularly, to make sure that you're adapting them, that you're making them relevant, you're making them applicable still, and revisiting them with the staff to gauge and confirm understanding and assimilation of whatever's in that policy and see how they're
One of the things I like to do in relation to that, with the leaders and their teams is to get them to map out their systems flow in the organization. You know,
I like
from where you start with a customer, it's basically mapping out a customer journey in some ways, or even a process flow, and asking at each point, is this working smoothly or is there friction here? So you're essentially looking for opportunities to increase flow in the system of the organization by reducing friction. And sometimes those policy processes are huge lumps of friction. Like, how can we make this easier, facilitate or eliminate this point of friction? And that is quite liberating when they start to look at that. And it's also a way of training people to look strategically at the organization, to see it as a system, an ecosystem, an entity, as opposed to just their little part of it. So they can see how that when they are a week late in their deadline, the knock-on effect on others, as an example, which is often a frustration for many organizations and teams.
And I recommend a similar exercise close to the point that you just mentioned in helping people connect to the broader purpose and impact of the organization. So when you're mapping it backwards, not only can you use it to, you know, make these processes and that flow better and eliminate any friction that you referenced, but also it helps people connect with one another and understand how their work impacts the next, but also how their work, despite the fact they may not ever meet the customer or the client they serve, it actually, it does connect. And it's because of the work they do on the daily that we're able to serve our broader purpose and impact as a whole, right? I very parallel, but sounds like it could be a win-win exercise to do that with your team, because it has
you can do it at the same time. You know, it's a systems map of the organization. And I think making things visual, like using visual language and visual imagery to look at problems or to look at a system in the business or the organization as a whole, is actually under practiced hugely in organizations and teams. And we have such a huge reliance on verbal oral communication in meetings. So just blah, 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 blah talking. And we miss so much opportunity to understand each other better and to understand the issues better by actually using visual methodologies as part of our facilitation of teams as leaders. So I think that's a very underutilized and underdeveloped skill amongst leaders.
And is it one that you help them develop?
Yeah. And there's draw a couple in people stuff as an example, but certainly my recommendation when I'm working with leaders is like, okay, let's take this problem and map it out. It's like, and the phrase I help them with is, when in doubt, map it out. So like, whatever issue, let's draw it, you know, let's draw a diagram about that. And there's different frameworks you can use, whether it's a quadrant model or the problem tree example or the systems map are three simple tools that you can use to start getting practice with that. Or a process flow like your action map is an example of that too. So it just makes it so much easier for people to get a handle on what is such a complex thing.
Identify sometimes where there's some bottlenecks and where, you know, does that really need to be happening in that way, and to help them innovate and think differently and help the team as a whole embrace the value of thinking outside the box and reworking stuff that's no longer working for us, right? You referenced your book really quickly. I know I want to be cognizant of time. Tell us a bit more about the book. I like the title,
People Stuff, of course, People Powered Solutions. You know, People Stuff is my fourth leadership book, and very excited to have won Australian Business Book of the Year in 2020 and HR Management Prize and finalist in leadership and book cover design, thanks to Lynn Kazali, my book cover designer. So that's the accolades of it, which just floored me, and so excited that happened. It was like, in any case, this book is about looking at complex issues. And the first chapter is about perspective. And it explores different ways of looking at issues. The problem tree is in there as an example. It's looking at what are the bigger factors and looking at scenario planning. So using some strategic thinking tools to get a sense of the landscape. One of the other chapters is looking at leadership archetypes for leaders. And I have 5 archetypes I get leaders to explore as a way of adding to their leadership facilitation kit in terms of how do they need to show up in a particular environment or situation, and to use one in particular, the elder archetype, to funnel all of their activities. And the elder archetype is about acting with wisdom and compassion. So best of the mind, wisdom, and best of the heart, compassion. And this philosophy comes from Cindy Wigglesworth, who wrote SQ21, the 21 skills of spiritual intelligence, which is advanced emotional intelligence. So the elder, wisdom, and compassion. And then there's also a chapter on the four devils of people stuff. So what happens when we're dealing with teams and the difficult behaviors that emerge? What are the causes of that? And what are the cures for it? And that's basically the book. It's quite a dense little handbook for some of the trickier things that we have to contend with as leaders.
Yeah, but it sounds like it's got like very insightful methodology and gives you the how, which is where a lot of books fall short, I find. They won't necessarily tell you, for example, which archetype to adopt in which kinds of scenarios and how to align and adapt your approach according to that scenario. So definitely we will share the link on how to get that book in the show notes. If you had one nugget of wisdom, tips, whatever you want to offer our audience as we close out this episode, what would you like to offer them? Maybe relevant to the future of leadership.
Yeah. So yes, I will close it off with that. It's a big picture in terms of the future of leadership. In my research, what I found is that there's some significant shifts that we need to make as leaders and as communities and as organizations in response to the emerging trends that we've got. And one of the big first shifts is around worldviews, coming back to what we started the conversation with. And the shift is looking at, it's an expansion shift as opposed to from this to that, it's this and that. And in business, one of the main principles is around growth. It's kind of the meta story of what business is all about, more and more and more and more. And we're nudging up against the ceiling of what that means. We're burning people out. We're using up resources on the planet and causing ripple effects we hadn't intended. So the shift in terms of our worldview that needs to happen to guide our businesses moving forward is growth and knowing how much is enough. And this idea of exploring enough is pretty critical for us. Like, how much money do we need? How many people do we need? How much impact is enough? Like, instead of going more, it's actually a radical change of mindset. And so that's the context in which I frame the practical application. Is that's one of the shifts that we need to make, is going from growth to enough, growth and enough, I guess. In the research then, looking at the other shift from remote working to looking at moving from headquarters to hubs, and looking at from being doers and executors in our business to being creative contributors, the three meta skills that leaders need to develop are collaboration, not just cooperation where we're working alongside it, but true collaboration where we're sharing ideas and building on each other. Creativity. So how do we actually explore new ideas and have an explorer's mindset? And the third piece is compassion. So how do I have this deeper understanding and care for other humans? So in order to execute on all that, here's the practical tip, is to really get curious. And curiosity is the antidote to hubris and arrogance and blind spots. So if we can dial up our curiosity by asking, why is that so? And having that as our anchor phrase. And another question alongside of that is, what could this mean? Is a better question than what does this mean? When we ask what does this mean, we get a reductive or reductionist viewpoint on a particular challenge or situation. For example, any number of the examples we looked at, my guys aren't completing their paperwork. What does this mean? They're lazy. Instead of asking, what could this mean? And having exploratory view. Yeah. So I think the practical tool is to equip yourself with those questions. What could this mean? And be very curious about this. Why is it so? And to look for different perspectives in your leadership. And that way we start to expand our sense of possibilities and to get more savvy in our exploration of solutions as well. So ask better questions.
Love it. Stay curious and ask better questions. Okay, what you unpacked in the last 3 minutes has told me, if you're open to it, that we probably need to have an entirely other episode based on the future of leadership, which is what, folks, we initially set out to talk about, but then we got into the weeds. And as most of my conversations go, I kind of follow the lead of the conversation, and we didn't end up touching on that. And I feel that it would be very valuable. So perhaps we would look at scheduling a second episode with Zoë down the road, definitely, so that we can dig a bit deeper and really dive in to that future of leadership and share more best practices relevant to preparing for said future. So thank you, Zoë, for joining me. It was an amazing conversation. I'm sure that our listeners got a lot out of it and were able to jot down a few notes of what they would like to implement the minute they're done listening to this episode.
You're welcome. It's been an absolute pleasure connecting with you, Lorianne, and this is really fun, actually. So thank you so much.
Yeah, it's always nice. And you joined me at 6 a.m. in the morning. Like, you've got to be committed. That's impressive. That's absolutely impressive. Well, maybe we plan the next episode for like 5 p.m. my time, which would at least give you an extra hour of sleep.
That would be good. Yeah, I could handle that.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to another insightful episode of People Powered Solutions.
Well, folks, thanks for joining us for yet another enriching conversation. To hear more about today's guests, make sure to check out the links in the description of this episode. Want to continue the conversation? Then head on over to our social media platforms, all of which are also linked in the description, to keep it going. Finally, don't forget to subscribe to make sure you don't miss another valuable episode.